There is a conversation that has happened in various forms, in various offices, on various film sets across 6 decades of Hollywood history. It goes something like this. A producer or a studio executive or occasionally a director reaches a point of genuine frustration with Jack Nicholson. With his demands, his schedule, his refusal to follow instructions, his insistence on doing things his way when the contract clearly specifies something else. And they begin to calculate what it would cost to replace him. They pull out the numbers. They call their lawyers. They run the math on recastings and reshootings, and the press fallout and the talent agency relationships and the insurance implications. And then, at some point in that calculation, they stop. They put the papers away. They pick up the phone and they call Jack's people and they say everything is fine and they work around whatever the problem was and they never mention it again. This has happened more times than the public record shows. The public record shows almost none of it, because the other thing about Jack Nicholson is that the stories that would embarrass the people who back down never get told. The people who back down have careers to protect. Jack Nicholson doesn't need to protect anything. He already won. To understand why no director in Hollywood has ever successfully fired Jack Nicholson, why the very idea of firing him has historically produced a specific kind of cold sweat in people who are otherwise not easily frightened, you have to understand what Jack Nicholson actually represents inside the machinery of the film industry. And that is not simply a great actor, though he is that. It is not simply a box office draw, though he has been that for 5 decades. It is something more structural, more architectural, more embedded in the way the industry works than either of those things. Jack Nicholson is, in the most precise sense available, a man the system cannot afford to make an enemy. And the reason the system cannot afford it is because Jack Nicholson understands the system. Its leverage points, its pressure points, its hidden dependencies, and its public vulnerabilities. Better than almost anyone who has ever worked inside it. He has spent 60 years learning exactly where the bodies are buried. Not metaphorically. The actual bodies. The actual decisions that studios made in the 70s and 80s that they would prefer the world not revisit. The actual behavior of actual powerful people at actual parties in actual houses in the hills above Los Angeles. Jack was there. Jack remembers. And Jack, crucially, has never needed the money badly enough to stay quiet about any of it. The first time the question of firing Jack Nicholson became relevant in a serious professional context was in the early 1970s, when Jack was still ascending. Not yet the icon he would become, but already the most dangerously talented and independently minded actor working in American film. The specific incidents vary depending on which account you consult, but the pattern is consistent across productions. Jack would arrive with strong opinions about how his character should be played, and those opinions frequently conflicted with the director's vision, and the director would discover that Jack's opinions were not the kind that could be overridden by a conversation about the script or a reminder about the contract. They were the kind that had to be either accommodated or fought, and fighting them meant fighting someone who was better at fighting than you were, even if you had the legal authority and the organizational power on your side. Jack understood, early and completely, that legal authority and organizational power are not the same thing as actual power. Actual power in Hollywood is the ability to make someone's life significantly more difficult than they want it to be without suffering equivalent damage yourself. Jack had that ability long before he had the credits to justify it on paper. He had it because of the specific quality of his intelligence, which is not the intelligence of a clever person, but the intelligence of someone who sees the full architecture of a situation. All its dependencies and vulnerabilities and hidden relationships. While everyone else is still looking at the surface. By the time Jack won his first Oscar in 1975 for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the question of firing him had become largely theoretical. You don't fire someone who just won an Academy Award for a performance that every critic in the country described as one of the finest in the history of American cinema. But the theoretical question is interesting precisely because the answer would have been the same even before the Oscar. Even in 1970, even in 1968, even before anyone outside the industry had heard of him, the calculation would have come out the same way. Because Jack's untouchability was never primarily about his fame or his awards or his box office numbers. It was about the specific combination of talent and intelligence and social positioning and accumulated knowledge that made him someone who could not be discarded without consequences that exceeded the cost of accommodation. Here is what that combination looks like in practice. When a director clashes with a difficult actor on a film set, the director has several tools available. He can invoke the contract. He can appeal to the studio. He can manage the actor through intermediaries, the agent, the manager, the publicist, applying pressure through those channels. He can, in the most extreme cases, fire the actor and recast. Each of these tools has costs, but they are manageable costs in most situations. With Jack Nicholson, each of these tools fails at the point of use in ways that are specific to Jack and not generalizable to other difficult actors. The contract doesn't help because Jack's lawyers have been smarter than studio lawyers for 30 years, and the contracts that Jack signs have provisions in them that most people don't notice until they try to enforce them in the other direction. The studio appeal doesn't work because the studio executives who would be doing the appealing have their own reasons for wanting Jack satisfied, reasons that predate the current production and will outlast it. The intermediary approach fails because Jack's representatives are not in the business of delivering bad news to Jack. They are in the business of protecting Jack, which means protecting him from exactly the kind of pressure a director might try to apply through those channels, and firing him. Recasting is the option that has always been technically available and has never been used, because the person who fired Jack Nicholson would spend the rest of their career explaining that decision in every meeting they ever had, and the explanation would never be satisfying, and the subtext of every such conversation would be, "You fired Jack Nicholson," which means either the project wasn't worth making or you weren't capable of handling the situation, and neither of those is a story that helps you. The most instructive example from the early period of Jack's career is the production of The Shining in 1980, which is instructive not because Stanley Kubrick fired Jack. He didn't, would never have, and the thought probably never seriously occurred to him, but because of what the dynamic between them revealed about how Jack operates when he respects the person he's working with. Kubrick was the one director in Jack's career who could have plausibly attempted to fire him, because Kubrick's control of his sets was legendary and his willingness to repeat takes until the laws of physics themselves seemed to bend to his vision was well documented. He did 127 takes of a single scene with Shelley Duvall. He reshaped productions entirely when the reality didn't match the image in his head. He was, in short, the kind of director who could have tried to bend Jack to his will through sheer attrition. He didn't try. He recognized, and this is the crucial thing, that what made Jack difficult was the same thing that made Jack extraordinary, and that attempting to separate those two qualities would destroy both. Instead, Kubrick worked with Jack's instincts, shaped them, channeled them, occasionally redirected them through suggestion rather than instruction. The result was Jack Torrance, one of the most indelible characters in the history of cinema, a performance so total and so terrifying that 30 years later it remains the defining cultural image of psychological unraveling in American film. No director who knew about The Shining could subsequently look at the option of firing Jack Nicholson and calculate it as an acceptable risk. What if this is the version where you would have gotten something extraordinary and you threw it away because it was uncomfortable? There is a specific story that circulates in Hollywood. Not in interviews, not in authorized biographies, but in the oral tradition of the industry, passed between assistant directors and line producers and development executives who have worked at the studios long enough to accumulate the kind of knowledge that never appears in press releases. The story involves a director, unnamed in every version, because the director is still working and the naming would cost too much, who in the mid-1980s made what he later described as the worst professional decision of his career. He had a genuine grievance. Jack, on the set of a production that had been going badly for weeks, had refused a specific directorial instruction, not a creative suggestion, an instruction clearly within the scope of what the director was contractually entitled to require. And the refusal had been delivered in the specific way that Jack delivers refusals, which is to say quietly, without drama, with a kind of absolute finality, that made further discussion feel not just futile, but somehow beside the point. The director, who was younger than Jack and had fewer credits and was operating under significant pressure from the studio to bring the production in on schedule, made the decision to escalate. He went to the producers. He made his case. The producers listened carefully. They asked several questions. And then they explained to him, also carefully and also quietly, that the situation he was describing was not one they were in a position to address in the way he was requesting, and that his best available option was to find a different approach to the scene in question. The director left that meeting understanding something he had not understood before he entered it. Not just about Jack Nicholson specifically, but about the architecture of power in the industry he was working in and his own position within that architecture. He found a different approach to the scene. The production finished. The film was released. The director went on to have a reasonable career. But he has told this story in various versions to younger directors he has mentored over the years, always with the same conclusion. There are people in this industry who are inside the system and people who are above it, and the difference between those two categories is not fame or talent or box office or awards. It is something older and harder to define, and Jack Nicholson is the clearest example of what it looks like when someone has crossed from one category to the other and there is no mechanism available for pulling them back. The middle period of Jack's career, roughly 1980 through the mid-1990s, is when the untouchability became structural rather than merely reputational. This was the period in which Jack cemented his position not just as a great actor, but as a specific kind of Hollywood institution. The person whose presence in a film was itself a statement about the film's seriousness, whose willingness to take a role was interpreted by the industry as a quality signal that no marketing campaign could replicate. When Jack signed on to Batman in 1989 and agreed to play the Joker, the decision to greenlight that film at the scale it was eventually made at was directly connected to his involvement. Not because Jack was the most commercially reliable person in the world. He wasn't, not in the conventional sense. But because Jack's judgment about which projects were worth his time was trusted by the people who financed films in a way that almost no other actor's judgment was trusted. If Jack thought a project was interesting, it was probably interesting. If Jack thought a director was talented, the director was probably talented. His taste functioned as a curatorial signal in an industry where most signals are noise. And you don't fire your most reliable signal generator. There is also the question of what Jack knows. This is the dimension of his untouchability that is most rarely discussed directly, because discussing it directly requires acknowledging things about the Hollywood of the 1970s and 1980s that the industry has preferred to leave unexamined. Jack Nicholson was not a peripheral figure in the social world of that Hollywood. He was central to it. His house in Mulholland Drive was one of the gathering places for a specific stratum of the industry. Directors, producers, actors, musicians, writers, the occasional politician or attorney or financier who had found their way into that orbit. The parties that happened in that house and the houses around it were not events that the people who attended them have been eager to document for posterity. They happened in an era before smartphones, before social media, before the assumption that everything was being recorded. They happened in a culture with very different ideas about privacy and discretion and the line between public and private behavior. Jack was there for all of it. He has an extraordinary memory. He has maintained his relationships with the people who were also there, and those relationships are built on a specific foundation of mutual knowledge and mutual discretion that gives each party leverage over the other. This is not a veiled accusation of anything specific. It is an observation about the nature of accumulated social capital in a closed community and how that capital, the simple fact of knowing what you know, of having been where you were, functions as a kind of permanent insurance against certain categories of professional threat. The period that best illustrates the fear factor, the specific quality of apprehension that Jack's name could produce in a room full of otherwise confident people, is the production of The Two Jakes in 1990, the long-delayed sequel to Chinatown that Jack both starred in and directed. The production was famously troubled. There were casting disputes and budget overruns, and a tense creative atmosphere that produced a film that satisfied almost no one. And yet through all of it, through every decision that a studio executive or a producer might have looked at and thought about pushing back on, there was a consistent pattern of accommodation. Jack wanted this. Jack got it. Jack wanted that. Arrangements were made. The studio that was financing the production had every conventional reason to exercise more control. They had the contracts. They had the money. They had the institutional authority. What they didn't have was the will to use any of it, because using it meant confronting Jack directly about specific decisions on a production he had a deep personal investment in, and that confrontation had a non-trivial probability of going badly in ways that would last beyond the production itself. It was easier to accommodate. It was always easier to accommodate. The incident that comes closest to an actual confrontation. The moment that most directly answers the question of what would happen if someone did try to fire Jack Nicholson. Occurred during pre-production of a project in the late 1980s that ultimately didn't come together, and the details remain somewhat murky because everyone involved has had 3 decades to smooth over the rough edges of the story. What is clear is that a studio executive, operating from a position of genuine institutional power and a legitimate grievance about Jack's behavior during negotiations, made what was intended as a credible threat in Jack's direction. The threat was not delivered directly. It went through representatives, as these things do. And it was phrased in the careful language of Hollywood business communication, which means it was phrased in a way that could be interpreted as a threat or as a negotiating position, depending on what response it produced. Jack's response made it instantly clear which interpretation applied. He did not respond with counter-threats, which would have been the move of someone operating from a position of equal power. He responded with silence, followed by a series of quiet conversations with other people in the industry. Conversations that the executive who made the original threat was not party to and could not reconstruct afterward. And within 2 weeks, the situation had resolved itself in Jack's favor without anyone being able to point to the specific mechanism by which the resolution had occurred. The executive in question did not make similar moves again. The story spread through the industry in the way these stories spread, through inference and implication and the occasional unguarded comment at an industry event. And it added another layer to the understanding of what it actually meant to pick a fight with Jack Nicholson. What directors who have worked with Jack consistently describe, when they describe the experience honestly, is not the fear of a specific retaliation, but something more ambient and harder to name. It is the sense that Jack is operating on a longer timeline than everyone else in the room. Most people in Hollywood are managing their careers quarter to quarter, project to project, calculating how each decision affects the next one. Jack has never operated that way. Jack operates from a position of such fundamental security. Financial security, reputational security, the security of someone who has already won every prize the industry offers and continues to work because he finds it interesting rather than because he needs it. That the normal instruments of professional pressure simply don't apply to him. You can't threaten someone with career consequences when their career has already achieved everything a career can achieve. You can't threaten someone with financial consequences when they are one of the wealthiest actors in the history of the medium. You can't threaten someone with reputational damage when their reputation is so thoroughly established that a single bad production doesn't move the needle. What you're left with, when you're contemplating action against Jack Nicholson, is the realization that you have very little leverage and he has quite a lot, and that this asymmetry is not temporary or contingent on any particular circumstance. It is the permanent condition of the relationship. And once you understand that, the decision to accommodate becomes not a capitulation, but a rational assessment of available options. The directors who have worked with Jack most successfully: Kubrick, Roman Polanski on Chinatown, Milos Forman on Cuckoo's Nest, James L. Brooks on Terms of Endearment, and As Good as It Gets, Tim Burton on Batman, share a common characteristic that is worth noting. None of them ever approached the relationship as one of authority and compliance. All of them approached it as a collaboration between two people with strong views, where the director's job was not to override Jack's instincts, but to engage with them seriously enough that the result was better than either party could have achieved alone. This is a different model of directing than the one most film school programs teach. It requires a specific kind of confidence. Not the confidence of someone who knows they are right, but the confidence of someone who is secure enough in their own vision to absorb a challenge to it without feeling threatened. The directors who have failed with Jack or who have had genuinely bad experiences have tended to be the ones who confuse their institutional authority with actual creative authority, who believed that because the contract said they were in charge, they were in fact in charge. Jack has a long memory for that kind of confusion, and he is not gentle in how he addresses it. Jack Nicholson is now in his late 80s. He has not made a film since 2010. He sits courtside at Lakers games and occasionally appears at industry events and is, by all accounts, perfectly content with the life he has constructed over 6 decades of operating in one of the most competitive and brutal industries in the world. He has never been fired. He has never been effectively replaced. He has never had a powerful person look him in the eye and successfully enforce a consequence that he wasn't prepared to absorb. And the industry, the directors and producers and studio executives who have worked with him or around him or in his shadow, has drawn its own conclusions from that record. Not the conclusion that Jack is easy to work with, because he has never been easy to work with, but the conclusion that what he brings to a collaboration, in terms of talent and intelligence and the specific quality of his engagement with material he cares about, cannot be replicated by someone easier, and that the alternative to accommodating Jack Nicholson is not a smoother production with a less difficult actor. It is a production without Jack Nicholson, which is a different and lesser thing, and everyone in the room knows it, even when they would prefer not to admit it out loud. There is one more thing worth saying about why no director has ever fired Jack Nicholson, and it is the thing that tends to get lost in the more dramatic versions of this story. It is simply that Jack Nicholson, when he decides to give himself to a project, gives everything. Not the performance of giving everything, not the professional simulation of total commitment that many highly paid actors produce, but the actual thing. The full investment of his intelligence and his instincts and his specific way of seeing human behavior, which is one of the most precise and unsparing ways of seeing human behavior that has ever been pointed at a camera. Directors who have been in the room when Jack is working at that level describe it as one of the most extraordinary professional experiences available in their field. They describe takes that were not planned, moments that emerged from Jack's relationship with the character that the script hadn't anticipated and that no amount of preparation could have produced. They describe the feeling of watching someone do something that could not be done twice, that was happening once and would not happen again, and knowing that the camera was running and they were getting it. You don't fire someone who gives you that. You work around whatever the problem is. You accommodate. You adjust. You find a way. Because the alternative is losing access to something that cannot be replicated, and that loss would haunt the project and your career and your understanding of what you might have made if you'd had the nerve to hold on. No director in Hollywood has ever successfully fired Jack Nicholson. That fact is not an accident or an oversight. It is the result of 60 years of Jack understanding precisely what he is worth and precisely what he knows and precisely how to make both of those things felt in a room without ever raising his voice above a certain temperature. It is the result of an industry learning, production by production and decade by decade, that the cost of accommodation is always lower than the cost of confrontation. And it is the result of something simpler and less strategic than any of that. Jack Nicholson, when the camera is rolling and the material is worthy and the collaboration is real, is capable of things that no one wants to be responsible for preventing. The fear of firing him is, at its most essential, the fear of being the person who stood between that and the world. That is a very specific kind of fear. It turns out to be very effective. There is also something worth understanding about the specific texture of what it feels like to be on a set with Jack Nicholson when the dynamic is working. When the director has accepted the terms of the collaboration and Jack has decided that the project is worthy of his full investment. Crew members who have been on those sets describe something that is difficult to convey to people who haven't experienced it directly. It is not simply the presence of a great actor doing great work, though that is part of it. It is something about the quality of attention that Jack brings to every moment of the process, not just the moments in front of the camera, but the hours of waiting and preparation and the small interpersonal negotiations of a working film set. Jack pays attention in a way that most people do not. He watches people. He files things away. He makes connections between what he observes and what the character he is playing would observe. And those connections show up in performance choices that were never in the script and that nobody planned for and that are often the best thing in the finished film. Directors who have been on the receiving end of this process, who have watched Jack take a scene they wrote and find something in it that they didn't know was there, describe the experience as one of the most creatively disorienting and ultimately rewarding things that can happen in the making of a film. You think you know what the scene is. Jack shows you what it actually is. And that revelation, uncomfortable as it sometimes is in the moment, is what the people who made great films with Jack Nicholson remember when they talk about those productions. Not the arguments. Not the refusals. Not the moments when the institutional authority failed. They remember the takes. They remember the specific seconds of specific performances that no other actor alive could have produced. And they remember the feeling of knowing, in real time, that they were getting something extraordinary, and that the cost of getting it was exactly the specific kind of difficulty they had been asked to endure. This is the final answer to the question of why no director in Hollywood has ever successfully fired Jack Nicholson. It is not fear of retaliation, though that fear is real. It is not the weight of accumulated social leverage, though that leverage is substantial. It is not the legal complexity of his contracts or the studio relationships or the talent agency infrastructure. It is this. The directors who have worked with Jack, even the ones who have found it the hardest, even the ones who have gone home at the end of difficult days and questioned whether it was worth it. Those directors have made some of the best films of their careers in collaboration with him. And the directors who have not worked with Jack, who have looked at the reputation and decided that a smoother process was worth more than the risk. Some of those directors wonder. In quiet moments, in the privacy of their own assessment of their own bodies of work, they wonder what they might have made if they had been willing to hold on through the difficulty to get to what was on the other side of it. Jack Nicholson has never been fired, because being fired requires someone willing to accept the permanent uncertainty of that wondering. And so far, no one has been. There is one more layer to this story that rarely surfaces, but that is essential to understanding the full picture. Jack Nicholson has, over the course of his career, done something that almost no actor of equivalent stature has managed to do. He has consistently chosen projects based on what interested him rather than what was safe, and he has been right often enough that his judgment has become a form of currency in the industry. When Jack passed on a project, people noticed. When Jack signed on to something unexpected. A Tim Burton comic book film, a romantic comedy with Helen Hunt, a crime ensemble with a director 30 years younger than him. The industry read those choices as signals. Not because Jack was infallible, he wasn't, but because his taste operated on a different frequency than the taste of people who were choosing projects based on market research and franchise potential and the calculated minimization of risk. Jack chose things because they were interesting. And interesting, it turned out, was a better predictor of lasting value than safe. The films Jack made because they interested him are the ones people are still watching. The films that were made without him because someone decided the process would be smoother with a more manageable actor. Most of those films are forgotten. That record is part of why no director has ever been able to make the case, internally or externally, that the production would have been better without him. The burden of proof runs the wrong direction. History is on Jack's side. If this story of power, of accumulated leverage, of 6 decades of an extraordinary man operating by rules he wrote himself inside an industry that has never quite known how to contain him, moved you. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this with anyone who has ever wondered what real untouchability looks like when it isn't performed. Have you ever worked with someone who simply could not be moved, not because of the position they held but because of who they were? Tell us in the comments, and stay tuned. Because the story of what Jack Nicholson actually did with that power, the choices he made when he could have made any choice at all, is even more extraordinary than the power itself.